before, the universe had a cause. But that cause must have been an uncaused cause of all subsequent causes. And we call the uncaused cause of all subsequent causes God. Now, let me illustrate that. Let's just go back to the illustration of, oh, here's a good one. I have two boys, a 14 and a 12-year-old boy, and they're at that stage right now where they are becoming increasingly aware of girls, right? Where back, when they were 8, 9, they didn't even know, they didn't even know that there was a differentiation really between them and girls. And now they're like, whoa, she's kind of cute, and it's simultaneously really cute and terrifying from a parental perspective. So somewhere in that mix, we either offered or our children asked, hey, where did I come from? And then that whole, birds and the bees things begins. Okay, well, you came from your parents. Okay, well, that lasts for, a few minutes to a few months. Okay, well, where did you come from? Okay, well, we came from our parents. Oh, okay, well, that lasts a few seconds. Well, where did they come from? From their parents. Okay, from their parents, from their parents, from their parent. You see how this works? Okay, this is what's called, a regressive causation. Does that make sense? So we're just going back. Okay, well, what caused that? We're just pretending like we're little children. Well, why? 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 Anybody have one of those? I got 2 of them. Why? Okay, so we're going back in an infinite a regressive causation. Now, here's the point. In the same way that we can't have an infinite number of books on the shelf and we couldn't have had an infinite number of days before today, listen carefully, we could not have had an infinite number of causes before today. Right? So we keep going, okay, well, what caused that? Okay, well, then what caused that? Okay, well, what caused that? And we just keep going back. Okay, well, what caused that? We're going to keep going. Well, what caused that? And we just keep going back, and as we make our way back, here's what's going to happen. Eventually, well, what caused that? Well, what caused that? We'll come to something that when we say, what caused that? We'll say, nothing caused that. That exists by virtue of its nature. It has no cause. It is uncaused. Oh, because if somebody says, well, what caused God? Well, guess what? We're right back in. Well, what caused that? And what caused that? And what caused that? But at some point, that regressive causation, we come up against something that was not itself the result of a former cause, a prior cause. Does that make sense? Now check this out. When Moses was standing at the bush and God said, hey, you go tell that rascal Pharaoh to let my people go, Moses protested and said, well, I'm not sure that's going to work just like you think, because who will I say sent me? And then God said, fascinating, I am. I am that I am, and am is the present tense of the verb to be. In other words, I exist. I exist. I exist now. I will always exist. I am the eternally self-existent one. Let me say it to you this way. God's non-existence is impossible. He exists by virtue of his nature. He is the uncaused cause of all subsequent causes. Now check this out. It gets even more amazing. That thing that we call God is really, really awesome and beautiful and amazing, and I'm going to tell you about that in the second presentation. Because at this point, it could just be like a wall. But how do we know that God is good and nice and kind? And that's what we'll deal with in the second presentation. Okay? So in the beginning, God. First 4 words of Scripture. Okay? Did that kind of make sense? Okay, it only took me 20 minutes. I thought it would take me somewhere between 20 minutes and 3 hours. So... you feeling good about that? Does it kind of make sense? How many people would say, that went completely over my head, you might as well have been speaking Swahili? I almost said Spanish, but I know there's a lot of Spanish-speaking people here. So, okay, let me give you another one here. Reason number 2 to believe that there is a God and that God exists is that life proceeds from living things. Okay, this is the fundamental tenet of all biology, that life begets life. Living things come from living things. Now, not only do living things come from living things, but as we're going to explore here, living things come from information. Living things come from information, from intelligence. And not only does Genesis 1 open with, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, John 1 opens with, in the beginning was the Word. Through him all things were made. What a strange thing to say. In the beginning was the Word. Well, this is very much a echo of Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then it says, and God spoke. And God said, let there be light. And God spoke, and God said, and God spoke, and God said, and God spoke, and God said. So what John says here is, in the beginning was the Word. And the Greek word here for word is logos. L-O-G-O-S, logos. It's the same word that we get words like biology from. Biology, bios, living, logos, the word about living things. Geology, geo, earth, logos, the word about the earth. Anthropology, anthropos, man, logos, the word about mankind. Logos, it doesn't just mean a word in the simple sense. It means intelligence. It means thought. It means purpose and intentionality. In the beginning was the Word. The purpose of words, of course, is to communicate, and communication demands, it implies, of course, intelligence and the desire to understand and be understood. That's why we communicate, right? Like many of us that have spouses. I don't think you're hearing me. No, I'm hearing you. I don't think you're hearing me. We use words, but you ever have those experiences? I don't think you're hearing what I'm saying, or maybe I'm not saying what I think I'm saying. You ever have those interactions in your marriage? Am I the only one? Right? Okay. Few of you sitting there feeling really pious, making me feel bad. All right, so along these lines, in 2007, this book was published by Roy Vargas. It's called There Is a God. Notice the word no is crossed out there. How the world's most notorious atheist changed his mind. And it was written by Anthony Flew and was co-authored by Roy Vargas. And fascinatingly, in that book, one of the world's most, arguably the world's single most academically influential atheists changed his mind. Okay, he was in his late 70s when he made this decision to change his mind. Some might say that, he was just hedging his bets. But he actually gives a really good evidentiary reason for why he changed his mind. Hey, can you bring me some of that water? It's really hard for me to see you just drinking that when my mouth is parched. Okay, so here he is, Anthony Flew. This is when he was a younger man, and he says, watch this. What I think the DNA material has done is show that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinarily diverse elements together. The enormous complexity by which the results were achieved looked to me like the work of intelligence. Now, Mr. Flew, who has subsequently passed away, thank you, Larry, Dr. Flew, who has subsequently passed away, should be hugely commended for doing something that academics find very hard to do. He publicly changed his mind on a position that he had published hundreds of papers and books on before. Right? This is one of the tricky things about academia, is that once you're published saying a certain thing, it can be difficult to go back on that. Anthony Flew, in my estimation, was a hugely courageous man, because for the majority of his academic career, the vast majority, he was an intellectually committed atheist. Okay? But as he came down toward the twilight years of his life, he said, listen, I'm committed to the axiom to go where the evidence leads. And with the discovery of DNA, it really sent the biological world into a stir. Now, I'm going to talk about Darwin tomorrow morning, but I'll give you the short version. When Darwin proposed originally his theory of natural selection, what we know as the survival of the fittest, they knew nothing about DNA. Origin of Species was published in 1858. The first draft was published in 1844. And DNA was not discovered until 1962. More than a century later. Well, what do we now know about DNA? Well, we know enough to know that the cool thing about DNA is not just the little spiral staircase. It's not the chassis that makes DNA so cool. It's not that it's, aesthetically pleasing. No, what makes DNA really cool is that it's made up of 4 amino acids that interact in a way so as to create what can really only reasonably be described as a language. As a language. Now, of course, as soon as we start talking about languages, we're talking about communication. And I'm going to grab a book here called a hymnal that has a language in it. Now, I'm not talking about the words, the English words. I'm talking about these other notes here, music. Does anybody here not read music? You do not read music. Okay, so when you look at this, it doesn't make a lot of sense to you, does it? But it makes, who here does read music? See, this is a remarkable thing. People that read music, that makes very good sense to them. They discern the code. They know that information is contained in that code. Intelligence created that code. Not only the creation of the code, but the specific songs that makes Wonderful Peace different from Be Thou My Vision. Those of us who don't read music particularly well, we look at it and it's just all gobbledygook to us. But there's a code there. There's a code there that contains information, and not only information, information that must have come from an intelligent source. In this case, from a person named Mary Byrne, who wrote, Mary Byrne wrote Be Thou My Vision, apparently. And this intelligent person created the song that we know as Be Thou My Vision that can then be put into a symbolic system that we have here in the notes. Now, here's the interesting thing about that. The very person that discovered DNA, one of the two people, James Watson, and this man is named Francis Crick, okay? In 1963, won the Nobel Prize, and this is what he had to say. He himself was not a believer, though he did put forward some sort of interesting ideas about where DNA might have come from. This is what he said. An honest man, which I regard myself as one, you could say women as well, an honest woman, armed with all the knowledge available to us, what's the next word? Now. Now, in other words, it would be unreasonable to hold people 100 years before the discovery of DNA to the same level of information and sophistication that we have now. Okay, so he says, an honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been, that's not easy to say, which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. Okay, with the discovery of DNA, again, it wasn't just the chassis of the spiral staircase looking thing. It was like, whoa, there's data in there. That's a code. That looks like a code, and it looks like a code that's communicating information. But this is where things get really interesting, because the only known source of information is intelligence. I want to say that again. The only known source of information is intelligence. And if there is actual data that's contained in a code, a biological code in DNA, it raises questions like, who put that information in there? Who put the information of the song, Be Thou My Vision, into this book? Not the publisher, but I'm talking about Mary Byrne, whoever that was. Who put the data into the DNA, the information? Genesis chapter 2, verse 7 says, the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Now this, as primitive as it might sound, is actually very sophisticated biologically, because it says this living thing, Adam, came from a formerly living thing, God. Now that raises the question, well, how long has God been alive? Where did God get his life from? But we already answered that question, didn't we? What caused that? And what caused that? And do I have to do this again? No. Okay. And what caused that? And what caused that, right? Remember, the answer to the question, hey, who shall I say sent me, was I am. I am alive. I have always been alive, and I will never not be alive, which makes it so hugely remarkable, and we'll talk about this next session, that Jesus, God, came as a man and did something that was foreign, alien to God. He died. And we'll talk about that in the next session. Okay, so we find words like this in the New Testament. Jesus says really, really, really audacious things like, Scripture says, in him was life, John 1. And I am the life, Jesus said. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the life. What a strange thing for a human being to say. Not I'm alive. I can say that. Jesus said, I am the life. When Jesus was speaking to Martha about the resurrection of her brother Lazarus, he said, I am the resurrection and the life. What an audacious and frankly ridiculous claim for a human being who wasn't God incarnate to make. You could never say that. I could never say that. In fact, even the life that I now possess, I do not possess by my own volition. I didn't choose to be born, and I'm not even, in a sense, choosing to be alive right now. My heart is doing things that I'm not willing it to do. It's just doing it autonomically without my consent. I'm actually quite pleased for you to keep doing what you're doing, but I'm not consenting to it. It's just happening. Right? This life is coming to me. That atrial node is firing and doing its thing, and you know, the peristaltic action when I eat, and all of these amazingly sophisticated biological processes and neurochemical processes are doing what they're doing in my body right now, quite without my consent, and frankly, without my knowledge. I wouldn't even know how to describe a lot of the things that are happening in me. Stephen C. Meyer, in his marvelous book, Signature in the Cell, writes, visitors to Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. Anybody here been to Mount Rushmore? Okay, I went to high school right near there, Rapid City, South Dakota. I was born in Cheyenne, born again in Laramie, and I went to school in South Dakota. So I love this illustration. I had to throw it in for South Dakotans. Visitors to Mount Rushmore in South Dakota infer the past action of intelligent design upon seeing some unusual shapes etched in the rock face. You might have noticed that there's four very unusual faces there. But why do they infer this? Well, because the shapes on the hillsides are certainly unusual and they are irregularly shaped. And thus, in this context, improbable. It seems hugely improbable that Teddy Roosevelt would have just ended up there by the forces of nature. But beyond that, observers recognize a pattern in the shapes that they know from the independent realm of experience, from seeing the faces of ex-presidents in photographs or paintings. So we say, hey, wait a minute, I've seen that before. And we transmit. We say, hey, but that looks like that. Well, that's kind of what's happening with DNA. We say, hey, wait a minute. Here's the Spanish language. It contains information. Just yesterday, Evelyn read to me from her Indonesian Bible, and it sounded beautiful, Evelyn. It was awesome. I didn't understand a word you said, but it sounded so beautiful, right? And I believe that it's saying something, though it means nothing to me. Okay, so we look at a language and we say, hey, look, that sort of seems like what's happening over here with DNA. And what Meyer is saying is, we go to Mount Rushmore and we say, hey, look, I've seen those faces before. They didn't just show up here randomly, right? Something happened here. There was some intelligent input that created this. The patterns on the mountains match the patterns the observers know from elsewhere. We've seen these faces before. We've seen this before. We know that that does not result except by intelligence. Our common sense reasoning might lead us to conclude that the information necessary to the first life, like the information in human technology or literature, arose from a designing intelligence. But modern evolutionary biology rejects this idea. And I'll pick that up tomorrow morning, 5 good reasons to doubt Darwin. Okay. So I conclude with this very simple idea here. The only known source of information is intelligence. Okay? And what we have in the biological realm is a lot of living things, which raises the question, where did they come from? Well, that's an easy answer. Came from. And in the evolutionary paradigm, eventually, if you trace that regressive causation back far enough, you have to say that life came from something that was not alive. And we have never yet witnessed that. We only believe that could happen. I don't actually believe it did happen. But if you believe that happened, you could only call that an article of faith. That you would have to call it what it is, because we have no experiential or evidential reason to believe that living things could come from non-living things. So you're welcome to believe that. But that requires no less, in fact, I would suggest even slightly more faith than simply saying, in the beginning was the Word, and through him all things were made. An intelligent living source for intelligent living things. See, I'm flattering you. Intelligent living things. And myself. I'm not even flattering you. You are intelligent. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, great. It's great to feel like you're not speaking Swahili. Not that there might not be somebody here that could understand that. Now, just a word about this. This will be by far this will be one of the most cerebral presentations, but it just kind of has to be that way. And sometimes it's fun to exercise your brain, isn't it? Welcome to Colorado. All right, lots of enthusiasm in here. Okay, reason number 3. This is my personal favorite. The best explanation of minds is mind. And if you don't mind, I'm going to explain this to you. See what I did there? Okay. Where do we get minds from? Well, first of all, let's start here. We are fairly sure that the mind is seated in the brain. We know this because when people have strokes, the mind is compromised because the brain is compromised. We don't know exactly how the brain works. In fact, we don't know at all really how the brain works. I shouldn't say at all. We do know. But in terms of an exhaustive treatment of what's taking place in the brain, it is marvelously complex. In fact, the most complex thing known of in the universe by far, there's not even a distant second, is the human brain. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the complexity of the human brain. First of all, the average human brain is made up of somewhere between 100 and 200 billion neurons. Okay, so you have somewhere between 100 and 200 billion neurons in your brain right now, but it gets even more amazing. Every one of those neurons has an average of 7,000 connections with other neurons. Okay? Which means then that the number of potential neuronal and dendritic connections in your brain are actually greater than the total number of atoms in the universe. Okay, so the total number of atoms in the universe, physicists estimate, is somewhere around 10 to the 81st power. So that's 10 with 81 zeros behind it. Okay, that's a very large number. For all intents and purposes, that's an infinitely large number, okay? The number of connections in your brain, not just connections, but potentially independent pathways, or not independent, but unique pathways, in your brain is something like 10 to the 121st power. Okay, now that might sound like it's only 40 bigger, 10 to the 81st, 10 to the 121st. It's not. It's gigantic. It's exponentially larger. So think about that. There is something between your ears. Now, some of you wives are sitting there thinking, well, not my husband. I don't know. There's like 2 connections in there. It's like fishing. It's like fishing and hunting, or, fishing and football, or something like that. Anyway, the point is this. Your brain is hugely complex. It is by far the most complex thing that we know of in the entire universe. Nothing even begins to compare. Cell phones, no. The most sophisticated computers, no. Nothing is even in the ballpark of the complexity of the human brain. And then, to make matters even more amazing, the processes, the neurochemical processes by which the brain operates are frankly astonishing. And they're learning so much now about the brain. In fact, I'm just a book was just recommended to me, and I read one chapter out of it called, I think it's called The Brain That Heals Itself. Has anyone read this book? The Brain That, is that the right title, The Brain That Heals Itself? I think it is. Anyway, The Brain That Heals Itself, they are discovering so much about the plasticity of the human brain. I'll tell you one little interesting thing that I learned. They did autopsies on New York City cab drivers from New York City, and they found that they have hugely disproportionately large, I might get the brain part wrong here, maybe hippocampus, would that be right? They have a really big area in their brain. A certain area, it might be the hippocampus, might not be, don't quote me on that. But anyway, so it appears what's happened is, somebody gets to New York City, you ever been to New York City, in my opinion, it's an absolute nightmare. And it's a nightmare on many levels, the first of which would be spatially. Like, how do you get from here to there? Well, these cabs drive, you just get in wherever you are, say, hey, 67th and Union, and they just take off. And they're driving, and they're seeing things in their mind. And over time, especially those that have been doing this for years, decades, their brain literally grows because the number of connections in that particular area of the brain becomes strengthened and magnified. It's remarkable what's happening in the brain. The plasticity of even the adult brain is astonishing, absolutely astonishing. Okay, well, the brain is one thing, but the mind is another. And here's where things get tricky. No one quite knows what the mind is. There are a lot of theories on what the mind is, but we don't know exactly what a mind is. And you can sort of illustrate this very simply by saying this. How many people here have ever seen a human brain? Okay? How many people here have ever seen a human mind? You've never seen a mind. In fact, crazily enough, you've never even seen your own. You're just going by faith that you actually have a mind, right? Right? And we even use language to describe this. We'll say things like, I might change my mind. But it wouldn't be normal for us to say, I might change my brain. This old brain, I'm going to turn it in, get a new one. Now, we do actually know that the brain can change, but you don't literally, take the brain out and put a new brain in. But our mind, we appear to be able to actually change our direction and change our character and change our identity and change our thoughts. We used to maybe be really persuaded about, this political position, but now we're persuaded this way. Or we used to think that this was the right answer to the math problem, but now we see that this is the right answer. Or we used to really enjoy, going downhill skiing, but then we had to get our ACL repaired, so we don't do that anymore. Whatever it might be. The point is that we can change our mind, we can change our character, and to some significant degree, we can even change our identity. And that's taking place in the brain, yes, but in this thing called the mind, which no one quite knows exactly what it is that we're talking about. Now, if you're not confused yet, let me ratchet it up a notch, okay, with Alvin Plantinga, who we mentioned last night, analytic philosopher and author. In his book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, okay, put your thinking cap really snugly on for this one. Plantinga says, as we go up the evolutionary scale, we find neural structures, that is brain structures, brain-like structures, with greater and greater complexity. Near one end of the scale, for example, we have a bacteria, right? And then we'll move through, earthworms, amphibians, mice, and chimpanzees, and you. Okay, so you have this continuum. Okay, Near one end of the scale, for example, we find bacteria. Plantinga says presumably they have no beliefs at all. Right? What do bacteria believe about the nature of reality? Probably nothing. What do they believe about anything? Plantinga says probably nothing. They lack, as near as we can discern, the neural structures to believe anything about anything. He continues. At the other end of the scale, down here, are human beings, right? Who have a rich and varied store of, what's that next word? Beliefs. And whose brains contain many billions of neurons connected in complex and multifarious ways. We just talked about that. So that the number of different possible brain states is more than astronomical. That was my point a moment ago. The number of connections in your brain, unique connections, are greater than the number of atoms in the universe. That's the point Plantinga is making. And the idea is that as you rise in the evolutionary scale, okay, from bacteria right through the animal kingdom to humans, as you go through more and more complex neural structures, at a certain point, somewhere on this continuum, Plantinga is saying as a philosopher, where is it? There arises something that you could properly call a belief, something that would be regarded as true or false. For example, I believe right now that you're enjoying this. Now, I'm just going by faith, frankly. Now, that belief that I have is either true or false, and that's what Plantinga is saying. Do dogs have beliefs? We don't know. Do chimpanzees have beliefs? Well, we don't know. But we're quite sure that down here at the bacterial end of the spectrum, they don't. So, but we know we do. So somewhere along this continuum, you get a sufficiently complex neural structure to have something called a belief. Okay? That's his point. Something that is true or false. At a certain level of complexity, these neural structures start to display belief content. And the creatures that harbor these structures have beliefs. And the question that I want to ask is this. What is the likelihood, and we'll talk about this tomorrow morning, given evolution and naturalism? In other words, if we assume that evolution is true and we assume that naturalism is true, i.e. there is no God. He says, this is all I want to know. If evolution is true and there is no God, materialism, construed as including materialism about human beings, what I want to know is the content thus arising in those neural structures true? In particular, what is the likelihood, given evolution and naturalism, that the content associated with our neural structures is true? What is the likelihood that our cognitive faculties are reliable, thereby producing mostly true beliefs? Do you see his point? He says, listen, I have a question as a philosopher. At what point do you get a sufficiently complicated neural structure to have whatever that being is hold to something that we would properly call a belief that could then be found out to be either true or false? And he says, hey, listen, if evolution is just, we'll talk more about this tomorrow morning, if evolution is simply an almost mechanistic process that's working on biological machinery, why would any of us in this room think that our thoughts are giving us any truth about the world around us or the world inside of us? You follow the point? It's a fascinating point. Well, anyway, I told you you'd enjoy it, but maybe you didn't. As if that's not complicated enough, let's make it a little easier. Let's talk about Albert Einstein. Simplify it. That's a joke. Albert Einstein famously said, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. Let me explain that. He said, the strangest and most incomprehensible thing, the most fascinating and amazing thing about the universe is that it can be understood at all. Okay? Now let me try and paint the picture here for you. Not only are you a marvelously intelligent and fashioned creature, you, I'm talking about you and you and you. Not only are you the amazing thing that you are aware to some degree that you live in a really cool world, in a really cool solar system, with a fascinating galaxy and an amazing universe. You are aware of that. Your dog isn't. Neither is your horse, and certainly not your cat, okay? I should have said certainly not your chihuahua, but anyway, don't get me started. I've already offended enough people. I'm not going to offend any more. Here's the point. Imagine that the evolutionary process had only advanced up to the point where the most complicated creature on Earth right now was an earthworm. Okay? So that's the most complicated thing. Just imagine in this thought experiment. The universe would still be, pretend like the universe is as exactly as it is now, but the evolutionary process is only up to an earthworm. The universe would still be the amazing, wonderful, unpredictable and unexpected thing that it is. The sun would still be the same distance from the earth. There would be all of these amazing biological and physical realities that would have made the universe and our galaxy and solar system the awesome things that they are. But here's the point. No one would know it. The earthworm wouldn't say, you know, I'm just so thankful to be alive. Did you see that sunset, Charlie, the other day? I mean, that thing. And how about that latest symphony that was composed by earthworm Beethoven? Man, that just lit me up. You see what I'm saying? Here's the point. The point is this. Surely this ought to raise our suspicions that you have two things. You not only have a universe that is tailor-made for the existence of intelligent minds and self-reflective minds that are aware of the space in the universe, you have minds that are aware of their space in the universe. So you have this coming together of two highly improbable things. Not only a tailor-made universe, but minds that can appreciate, hey, wait a minute, this is an amazing universe. That's Einstein's point in part. The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that there are minds here to comprehend, hey, this is really amazing. Now, Dr. Eugene Wigner, who won the Nobel Prize for something, I got all my Nobel Prizes mixed up because I'm quoting so many of them tonight. He says the enormous, any engineers here tonight? Any engineers? Okay, there's one engineer. There's one. The engineers are not really like, what's he going to call me up or something? Nobody's going to raise their hand. Dr. Eugene Wigner says this, the enormous usefulness of mathematics is something bordering on the mysterious. Math is hugely useful. There used to be conversations and discussions about whether or not math was just a game that we play that's sort of internally consistent. But we now know that math is telling us something about the external world. We know this because we build bridges based on engineering principles and physical principles, and those bridges stay together. We know because we've got people to the moon and back. We know that math is telling us something about the nature of the universe because we have phones that work. And numbers are telling us something about the world out there. That's his point. Okay? The enormous usefulness of mathematics is something bordering on the mysterious. There is no rational explanation for it. The miracle, hey, there's that word again. Keeps showing up in these scientific quotations. The miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of the laws of physics, I love this, is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. Okay, in other words, why is the universe this way? Why did the universe turn out just like this? Not only with all of its mathematical beauty and symmetry, but all of its biological and neurological beauty. And it created a mind that can apprehend that we are here and appreciate it, that can listen to a symphony from Beethoven, that can look at a sunset, that can taste a mango. I'll talk about that next. I'm going to talk about mangoes next time, next presentation, and appreciate. Hey, this is a really cool thing. Okay, I better get moving. I'm going too slow. Romans chapter 7, we talked about this last night, this internal conflict. Remember that? I want to do what I don't do, and I don't end up doing the thing that I should. Look at how he ends this. Oh, wretched man that I am, Romans 7. Who will deliver me from this body of death? I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. Now watch what Paul does here, and I've always loved this text. So then, with the mind, I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh, the law of sin. Now look at that phrase there. I myself. What a fascinating phrase. What an interesting thing to say. Paul feels the conflict between his fleshly desires and his mental, spiritual desires. And so what he says is, with the mind, I myself. Let me translate that for you. The person that I know I really am. And let me tell you, every one of you in this room feels exactly the same way. Now, I don't know that I can't prove that, but I assume that you feel like I do. That you're an actual person. Are you with me on that? That you will sometimes look at yourself in the mirror and say, man, that was a really stupid thing you did. You think you're talking to someone. Right? Are you with me? Or we'll say things like this. We'll say, oh, my arm got in the way. Okay, now just think about that. Oh, my arm got in the way. Or I bumped my nose. Okay, you don't say I bumped me. You take it to mean that there is some you, and you're kind of stuck in this body, and that thing got in the way. And you bumped your nose. You see the difference here? There's something that's immaterial about you. There's something that's spiritual about you. There's something that is, yes, it's encased in this physical skin and bone and blood that we are, but you know that there is an I myself to you. That's what Paul says here. Man, this conflict stinks. I'm over this conflict between what I want to do and what I actually do and what I don't want to do and all of that. And he says, but I know that I myself, the person that I actually am in my identity, I'm going to serve God. All right. Reason number 4, I'll make this super duper quick. There are things that are actually and always wrong. This is a very good reason to believe in God. It's sometimes called the moral case for the existence of God. And here's a very simple version of it. Number 1, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Number 2, objective moral values do exist. Therefore, God exists as the lawgiver. Now, if God, to quote Dostoevsky and his brothers, the Karamazov, if God does not exist, everything is permitted. At most, you could say, I don't prefer that. But you could never say, that's wrong. Right? No one could ever, we couldn't really actually pass judgment on an act morally. We could only say, hey, look, I don't prefer that. That's not my preference. That's not what I would want you to do. But we would have an impossible framework with which to say, hey, that's wrong. So I want to ask you this question. Is it wrong to torture children? I'm just asking you just a simple question. Is it wrong to torture children? Now I'm going to ask a follow-up question. Always? Under all circumstances? How you answer that question will reveal to you whether or not you believe in moral relativism or you believe in moral absolutism. If you believe in moral relativism, then you can imagine that under some extenuating circumstance, it might be appropriate to torture a 4-year-old child. Right? But if you say, no, that's always wrong under all circumstances, then you are not a moral relativist, you are an absolutist. But here's the problem. You, in your humanity, all 5'8", 150 pounds of me, I possess no moral or physical platform from which I possess no moral or physical authority to say to you what's wrong or right for you. So I assume that when you say that it is always wrong under all circumstances to torture children, that you are not simply saying that you don't prefer it or you don't want Americans to do it or that you don't want to do it in your neighborhood. I think you're saying that you don't think anyone should ever do it under any circumstances at all. Is that what you're saying? Of course, you recognize you have no moral authority to make that statement. But you still believe it to be true. Well, you believe it to be true because you believe in what the vast majority of people used to believe, and many still do, and that is that there are some moral absolutes, things that are always right and things that are always wrong. And these moral absolutes actually transcend cultures. They are not culturally conditioned, and I can sort of illustrate this. There is no culture on earth where it is considered honorable to flee from battle. There is no culture on earth where it is considered honorable to treat with cruelty those that have treated you with kindness. Okay? If morality was really just a matter of perspective or culture or opinion, you would expect there to be radically different moral systems that the world operates by, but in fact there is not. I'll give you another good example. There are cultures, for example, the Islamic culture, that say that a man can have as many wives as he can reasonably and responsibly provide for. In the Christian culture, it's one man, one wife, okay? Now, you might say, hey, these are radically different cultures. Not so. They're actually variations on a theme because both the Islamic and the Christian culture value fidelity to your spouse. How that's interpreted, whether numerous wives or a single wife, that's a variation on a theme, but the overriding moral consistency is fidelity. Do you get the point? And lots of examples of this could be given. There are very few cultures in the world, for example, where rape is considered honorable. Okay? So even though there are variations on the moral themes that wrap the world, and there are some morally perverse cultures, that is true. But for the most part, we recognize, as do all cultures, that there are certain things that are wrong and not honorable, and there are certain things that are right and honorable. And the question is where does that come from? Well, not only the easiest, but I believe the best philosophical explanation comes from texts like this. Leviticus 11:45, God says, hey, listen, you be holy because I'm holy. As the holy lawgiver, I am uniquely qualified to say to you, behave in a certain way, or conversely, do not behave in a certain way. Okay, last point here. Man, this 8:30 thing, I don't know. Whoo-wee, you guys are just, your interaction is just, it's prodding me on. It's prodding me on. All right, reason number 5. Now, this is the one that I told you was venturing into the realm of certainty. It ventures into the realm of certainty. But it's not a certainty that I could demonstrate to your satisfaction or that you could demonstrate to mine, but it is a certainty that you could demonstrate to your own satisfaction. Now, you might remember last night I used the illustration of the oatmeal raisin cookie. You taste the oatmeal raisin cookie, you think it tastes really good. I taste it, I think it tastes really good. Nothing that I could say or do would persuade you that that cookie does not taste good. If you think it tastes good and you like oatmeal raisin cookies or chocolate chip cookies or mangoes or blueberries or whatever it is that you like them, and no amount of persuasion on my part or anybody else's part could persuade you that you don't. You know it. You know it experientially. You know it intuitively. In fact, you know it incorrigibly is the technical term. You know it and you can't not know it. You know it. Now, you don't know if I like chocolate chip cookies. I might tell you that I do, or I might tell you that I don't. But you would have no way of knowing if I was telling you the truth or not. But I know if I like them, and I can't not know it. You follow that? So with that in mind, check this out. Scripture says, "Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good." Now, this is a fascinating invitation because it's an invitation to personal experience, to something that you yourself can taste, and that no one else might be able to have that exact experience or taste that you'll have. For example, as I mentioned last night, the only taste buds that you'll ever taste with are your own. The only eyes you'll ever see with are your own. The only ears you'll ever hear with are your own ears. You'll never hear through my ears or see through my eyes or taste with my taste buds. Does that make sense? So God doesn't say, hey, look, believe what he says tastes good. Hey, believe what she says is great. No, God says, hey, you. Hey, yeah, I'm talking to you. Yeah, I'm talking to you. Bob, I'm talking to you. Every one of us, God says, hey, you, I'm talking to you. You taste and see, experientially, individually, and you will know that the Lord is good. John chapter 14, verse 23, Jesus said it like this. Jesus answered and said to him, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him. And check this out. What a weird thing to say. And we will come to him and make our home with him. Jesus says, if you believe what I'm saying, my Father and I will come and live in you. We will make our home with and in you. What a strange thing for God to live in you. But this is exactly the teaching of Orthodox Christianity, that God comes and lives in you, that you are the temple of the Holy Spirit, and that God experientially lives and dwells inside of you. That's a giant, right? That's a big thing. Romans chapter 8, verses 15 and 16. Paul says, you did not receive the spirit of bondage to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption, by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit and tells us that we are the children of God. And if children, then we are heirs. And if we are heirs, then we are joint heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together. What Paul is saying here is that God's Spirit comes into your life, and God's Spirit tells you personally and individually, you're my daughter. You are my daughter, and I love you very much. You are my son, and I love you very much. I think you're awesome, and I want you to think I'm awesome. God does that to you. Now, here's the cool thing. I cannot transfer that experience that I am having and have had to you. It's not possible. But you could no more convince me that I'm not having that experience than you could convince me that I don't like the taste of oatmeal raisin cookies or mangoes. I am having that experience. And here's a remarkable point. It's a very important, sophisticated epistemological point. It means that how we know what we know. I know something for certain that I cannot prove to your satisfaction. But you can know it too, but you can't prove it to anybody else's satisfaction. The invitation is always to the individual, not just to believe and to hope, but to know. Peter said in John chapter 6, Jesus, we have come to believe and to know that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus said in John 15:15, you made it. I no longer call you servants, because a servant doesn't even know what his master is doing. He doesn't know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends. I call you my friend. For everything I learned from my Father, I have made known to you. Reason number one, time had a beginning and thus very likely a beginner. Reason number two, life proceeds from living things. Reason number three, the best explanation of the mind is mind. Reason number four, there are things that are actually always wrong and right. And number five, you yourself can know experientially that God is here and that he loves you very much. All right, now that was a bit of a long presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and you will see. We're still going to try to get you out of here by 8:30. It's going to be a miracle of grace. All right. God bless you all. Go get something to eat.